My first time playing Nightreign, I queued up with my one buddy who stayed up late to play with me on release night, and we joined with a random match-made player, fought through the world, slew the Cerberus dog, and even unlocked a secret hidden character. It was a blast, had piqued my curiosity, and left me excited to play more. He had to go to bed, so I played a few more matches by myself, relying on the matchmaking for my teammates, and each run was successively more miserable. What happened? Was the game trash? A poorly balanced mess? Did we just get lucky the first time? I was left confused and very mixed on my feelings. Dozens of hours and even more runs later, I circled back around to thinking it was great again, but that journey to learn the game and figure out how to find the fun was a rough one. How was the game so good and so bad at the same time? Well, turns out, Nightreign is a shockingly well-crafted game that sadly gets bogged down by the Elden Ring half of its name, both in the design space and in public perception. There's no doubt about it, this game is extremely fun when it's working as intended, but it's also diametrically opposed to what a Souls-style game is. And that's not a bad thing. The design decisions that were made for this game suit the type of game they are trying to make incredibly well. But the game itself is for a very different audience than what the name brand attached to it brings in, and that inevitably will bring in a lot of friction in the way it's perceived. I even struggled myself to find enjoyment in what this game was for quite a while before everything clicked and the design choices started to all make sense to me. It's certainly not without flaws, and in fact there are quite a few of them, but that's what we're here to discuss. What makes this game come together so well, and what needed more time in the design chamber. Before I go any further, some housekeeping. This is not a review, this will be a full game critique. I will be discussing spoilers for gameplay elements from the entire game and narrative elements lightly as needed. I also played on the release version in case any changes are made later down the line. I've gotten every achievement in the game except for a couple RNG events that never showed up in my dozens of runs, at the point where less than 1% of players had achieved most of these. Now, without any further delay, the night is coming, so let's get moving. Going into Nightreign, I had a lot of skepticism. I love every game in the Souls franchise, but the multiplayer elements have always been janky, to put it mildly. When it works, there can be some really fun moments, though often more time is spent trying to get it to work than actually working. And so a spin-off exclusively focusing on the multiplayer gameplay both excited and worried me. It might mean that they finally got their shit together and made the network systems work fluidly, or it might mean we got a game that has too much technical debt to actually fulfill the creative promise it offers. What we got was something in the middle, but surprisingly more to the positive side of the spectrum. The password system still exists, but you can also just directly invite your friends and queue together. If you've never played a Souls game, then my praising being able to invite your friends might sound like sarcasm, but that's honest praise, and a testament to just how obtuse the online mechanics I'm referencing were. There's no weird meta item to use to select which boss you want. There's no requirement to be standing in just the right spot and waiting around to link up with your friend. It's still not a fully modern online system, but it works in all the functionally necessary ways you need it to for the pure gameplay to work without hassle. There's another issue with online play, however, that has always been part of Souls games, but is on full display in this game. Going back across every Souls game, I can confidently say that the most fun I had was always playing co-op with my buddies. I can also say that the game was often at its worst. The games are clearly not designed to be played with multiple player characters. The enemies, from fodder all the way up to bosses, cannot handle having two targets, and often this simple change can make the boss experience go from this really enjoyable experience of learning the boss's steps and forming your own counter steps, like some kind of competitive dance class, into something far more janky. Often the bosses will get stuck either spinning between the two players doing nothing, or focusing entirely on one player while the other freely attacks endlessly. And even when the boss moves do flow as intended, the constant shift between players can make the otherwise well-crafted moveset into much more of an RNG smash fest. I can't tell which move to be dodging when they start it facing away from me, and the constant switching makes the otherwise readable animations very messy. And even if I do get hit, I'm not that worried because I can run away while the other players take the boss in order to freely heal and run back in, almost without risk or consequence. If the peak of Souls games is learning and overcoming a well-crafted boss fight, then adding a friend removes all of that joy. That said, there's an inherent joy to sharing the world and experience with a friend, Because, like I said, even though the game itself is worse, I am having more fun with friends, and Nightreign encapsulates that dichotomy to a T. Given how aware I, and presumably the dev team, was of that flaw, I was very curious to see how they would address it, and somewhat shocked to see it was barely tackled at all. A lot of the bosses feel poorly designed for multiple players, and lose out on a lot of the intricate back and forth that would otherwise be the highlight of my Souls experience. However, the shared teamwork and discovery with friends combined with a game structure that actively incentivizes that cooperation makes the multiplayer truly excel. From what I can tell, there has been no AI changes to any bosses or enemies on the field, and the nightly bosses have been amped up a bit with new moves geared slightly towards play with multiple characters, but often in only barely noticeable ways. The 8 major Night Lords, however, which one could argue are the meat and potatoes of this game, despite taking up a minority of the game time, are surprisingly better tuned for co-op play. They all have some kind of mechanic that feels similar to what one might find in an MMO experience. Mechanics like having to shoot the jellyfish before it touches the ground and wipes the party, or having to break all of the golden seals to prevent a phase change. These additions make the Night Lords a far more fun experience, though unlike an MMO raid, each boss only has 1 or 2 mechanics of this type instead of a whole series of them. The rest of the fights will play out just like any co-op run of a Souls game, with the boss bouncing randomly between players, getting tons of free hits in while they retarget, and, the true downside of the whole experience, never really hitting that groove of learning and mastering a complicated dance pattern with the boss. Despite enjoying all but one of the Night Lords, I reached a point where I could consistently beat all of them without fail despite never really learning how to handle large chunks of their kit. I could tank a hit here or there and never really worry, whereas a Souls-like would require me to come up with at least some kind of an answer to every move in the boss's kit to be able to consistently win. And this brings us to the first major issue the game has going for it. It sits in this confusing middle ground between a single-player Souls-like and a multiplayer battle royale. 2 very different genres with a questionable amount of overlap between player bases. If you want the experience of a Souls-like, you will find next to none of that here, but you will find the design ethos of a Souls-like baked into everything. What I mean by this is, the game feels almost like a fan mod where they took the base Elden Ring game and jerry-rigged it into this roguelike / Fortnite game mode. And I suspect that's actually quite close to what truly happened. From looking at the design choices and knowing about FromSoft's development history, I suspect this game was made because Miyazaki wanted to give another dev an opportunity to make this cool idea of a game that they had, and let them use the already made and existing Elden Ring assets as a way to speed up the design of that game by probably multiple years. And I think that's completely fine. I actually think that's pretty cool even. If you can make a new game in half the time by using a lot of the work you've already done, that's a perfectly valid way to let the dev team hit the ground running. They get to spend more time on the design goals they want to work with, and less time on a lot of the busy work of making the core game systems. And we as consumers get more games faster. I don't want all games to be made like this, but in the era of 5 to 7 year dev cycles, there's certainly a lot of space for more games in this category. But the downside of that is that its identity is tied to that of a very different game. This game is online, it's fast-paced, it requires teamwork and communication. It's almost the polar opposite of what a Souls-like strives to achieve. In Elden Ring proper, the game is slow-paced. The player is free to explore and discover things on their own time and at whatever pace suits them. It's the type of experience many players find relaxing despite the reputation of being a difficult game. If a player is struggling with something, they can keep experimenting with it until they figure it out, or they can move on and do something else. There are mysteries to uncover and rewards tucked into every nook and cranny. The gameplay is about slowly and methodically combing through vast areas, hunting down every enemy, exploring every crevice and corner, and generally fully clearing each and every area while collecting everything they can find. In Nightreign, the player is on a clock from the moment they touch ground. If something is confusing, they have but a moment to ponder this before they are wasting too much time and need to move on to the next thing. It's more advantageous to sprint right past a large portion of enemies, skim items to take only a select few, and skip even full areas to prioritize more helpful ones. The systems in this game are designed for almost the polar opposite experience. I would go as far as to say that having not played a Souls-like will put you at a much better starting position to play the game well than having to undo all of that learned knowledge and muscle memory of a Souls veteran. On the other hand, Nightreign relies so heavily on already knowing so many systems in Elden Ring that it almost feels like Elden Ring should be the tutorial for this game. The core functionality of so many of the systems, from poise to stats and scaling to the massive list of weapons, skills, and spells, is barely explained, if at all, in this game, to the point where I am unsure someone could even understand this game enough to win without having played that game, or being dumped a lot of information from a friend who's already played that game. A new player would never even know that the different weapons have different scalings. They even removed that information from the tooltips of items and shoved it in an out-of-the-way codex back at base. Even for players who already have a base idea that curved swords are dex scaling and axes are strength scaling, would not know the exact letter scaling and the differences between weapons without looking it up. Not to mention that many weapons are unclear as to if they even are daggers or rapiers or swords or something else until you select them from the list and actually equip it. Like how the Revenant's starting weapon, named Cursed Claws, are classified as fist-type weapons and not claw-type. If you didn't know that the Bloody Hellas was a heavy thrusting sword, you would probably think it looks like a dagger in the reward selection menu. The Duelist's Great Axe? Actually a colossal weapon and not a great axe. The Warhawk's Talon? Well, that's a straight sword. The Bastard Sword? Actually a great sword. Death's Poker? That's also a great sword. A great sword? Well, that's obviously a colossal sword. Zamor Curved Sword? Not a curved sword. Onyx Lord's Greatsword? Not a great sword. Axe of Godfrey? Not an axe or a great axe. Golem's Halberd? Not a halberd. And the player needs to synthesize this all and make a decision in a split second during the gameplay. But for some reason, all of this information, from scaling to stats to even the weapon class, has been removed from the tooltip and placed in a codex you can only access when in the hub, or a third level menu that most players don't even notice exists, much less have the time to page into to get that information from every single drop. I'll touch on this type of obscurity issue a lot more later, but for now I just wanted to use it as an example of the way in which this game sits confusingly between worlds. It wants to be something very different from a Souls-like, but is using the most famous Souls-like as a base for all of its design structure. And so this issue will end up creeping into every point we touch on throughout the video because it is intrinsically intertwined at a core level. Now you're caught up on roughly where I was after my first few runs. Elden Ring is a great game built on solid fundamentals, so even a game that seems like a mess is still kinda fun because the core gameplay is fun. But as I learned more about the game and saw it not as a Souls-like but as its own weird experience, I realized what the systems were all trying to do, and it's something I truly love. This is a co-op game through and through. A game about planning your route through a time-sensitive area, optimizing your path, creating a build on the fly, and preparing to hunt the final threat. Each boss has an elemental weakness, and the areas in this world will let you know what type of rewards they drop. This means, as you are dropping in, you can be planning the full day's route and thinking about where to go to get prepared as best as possible for the planned final boss. Different types of structures will have certain rewards. Cathedrals have incantations, camps have weapons of a certain element, forts have sorceries, everjails have runes or permanent buffs, churches have flask upgrades, and so on. You know where all the things you need are, and it's just a matter of properly executing that plan. And then all of that preparation culminates in a well-crafted boss fight that determines if you did a good job or not. A lot of this requires strong coordination with your teammates. Sometimes it's better to split up a bit to handle a couple tasks simultaneously, and sometimes it's better to rush an objective down together to do it as fast as possible. Getting the right items requires trading with your team, knowing both what you need and what your allies are looking for. Hitting the right locations to get the needed gear not just for yourself, but for everyone. Knowing when to retreat and when to pivot to a different strategy are key skills. And that's all not to mention the fun of Elden Ring combat to begin with, which combined with the expanded class system creates a lot of synergies to work with that makes the moment-to-moment combat experience a thrill. Having a team operate as a well-oiled machine, hitting the final zone with max level and great weapons, and clobbering the boss is a delight, and involves a refreshing amount of tactical thinking and cooperation. This of course touches on a divisive subject, being the multiplayer. Nightreign was very clearly designed with 3 players in mind. From the ground up, every design choice is centered around creating fun tasks that require multiple players to work together to properly handle. From boss mechanics that literally require another player to hit an enemy you can't target, to more abstract concepts like the balance of loot clearly requiring cooperation to share and gear properly. And yet there is a single-player mode that, when the game first released, caused quite an uproar. People want to be able to play by themselves, especially fans of Elden Ring who enjoy playing single-player games. But that's not what this game ever tried to be. It's one of the rare games that actually prioritized the multiplayer design choices over the others. Whereas most co-op games function more like single-player games that technically let other people be there too, Nightreign really feels like the encounters and gameplay flow was intentionally made for one player to not be able to handle, and thus require teamwork from multiple players. Again, the Elden Ring name is weighing this game down. It's a trade-off, as I mentioned earlier. To make a game without the brand would take much longer, but now there are player expectations to deal with. Perhaps this is controversial, but I think including a single-player option at all was a mistake, as it opens up the door to a discussion on the solo experience when that seems to be a choice they did to appease stubborn players who don't want to play co-op, rather than a way they actually intended the game to be played. No one argues that Apex Legends needs a solo mode that lets players fight three-man squads by themselves. It's understood that the game was designed around a certain type of gameplay. Sure, the game would be better if we wave a magic wand and give it a robust single-player experience, but in reality, spending time and resources on that would be building out an entirely different game and mechanics to make that experience work just as well. It's perfectly fine to focus on just making a good 3-player game, and this disappointment only exists due to the Elden Ring name, and due to promising a solo mode that's only kinda playable because it wasn't really the primary goal of the game's design space. Even if the solo experience is eventually ironed out and made to be more balanced, without core changes to what the game is, it will always be a watered down version of what the game excels at. The game wants you to talk with your friends, to plan and strategize. When picking a reward, you aren't only looking for a tool for yourself, but for both of your friends too. The game has shared loot instead of instanced, and lets you drop and trade things because it wants you to be sharing with your team, to be working in tandem to best prepare the whole group. A lot of this is not clear at the onset of the game, however, and thus my early experience was much more mixed. I was frustrated at getting a lot of bad RNG on my rewards, before I realized I was often getting great rewards to share with my team. And once we started pooling our rewards and pathing properly, we started winning basically every run. At first I thought mines were useless, having tons of worthless fodder and just a single low reward enemy in a long time-consuming maze, before realizing that the difference between a blue and purple weapon was game-changing, and skipping the smaller enemies makes the process very quick, thus meaning that hitting at least one mine is somewhat required actually, and not worthless. Which is why, despite what I said earlier, I slowly realized that they actually did do something quite clever to handle the flaw of boss mechanics being trivialized by multiple targets in co-op. It's just not immediately obvious because it has nothing to do with the bosses. They made the classes and cooperation the interesting part. Instead of trying to find a way to get the intricate experience of learning a boss to work in multiplayer, they shifted the focus. Now, the relatively simple gameplay of a character in a Souls-like has been amped up to be its own complexity to learn and optimize. The fun is in figuring out how to work all of your class's mechanics together in the best way, and how to fuse that with each of your teammates. Your game plan as Iron Eye will be very different with two other Iron Eyes versus when paired with a strong melee character like a Guardian or a Raider. As a Duchess with a Wilder, you are likely looking for his ult to come out to maximize your rewind damage, but with a Recluse and a Revenant, you are probably just trying to rewind every volley of chip damage from their spells. See, these classes are shockingly well crafted such that not only is every single one fun, each one is unique, each one is well balanced and viable, and most importantly, each one has different considerations for your game plan depending on which allies are being paired with it. A Guardian with ranged allies might forsake offensive tools entirely to become the ultimate shield wall to tank the boss while their friends destroy the boss without any hassle. Often as a Duchess, I'm looking for the less likely to be targeted stat to make sneaking in and rewinding damage easy. One run, I had 2 mages for allies, so I actually dropped my less likely to be targeted items for them, and became the de facto tank, using my increased dodging power to just kite the boss around the arena while my allies did all of the real work. The fact that I was able to fulfill the same effective purpose as a Guardian, using a radically different tactic and character, was both thrilling and rewarding, but also a credit to the creativity and flexibility of the class design that it was even possible to accomplish. I could go on about the different classes and how they work, but I don't want this to become a strategy guide, and there's plenty more game design to critique, so out of respect for both my and your time, I'll keep it moving. Nightreign has a weird relationship with clarity. It's a fast-paced multiplayer game with a plethora of randomized loot, so you would expect there to be very clear, easy-to-parse descriptions of what every new item or effect does. But because it's inheriting its design ethos from Elden Ring, descriptions are often vague, wanting the player to experiment and figure out what they mean. What is a thrusting counterattack, for example? If you've played Elden Ring, you probably remember having to figure that out, so you know now, but without the knowledge from a different game, you'd be clueless, and especially so as you have to decide to keep or throw it out in only a couple of seconds. Even if you wanted to test it out, there's not really time for you to go and find an isolated enemy to create a controlled environment to do science. You have to get going, or lose. What I'm trying to explain here is that, while obscure descriptions work in a Souls-like, they don't work here. In a single-player game, the ambiguous descriptions can create mystery and curiosity in the player, and they can take their time to figure it out at their own pace, and possibly have a fun discovery when it's finally revealed. Fostering that kind of gameplay in this game just means that you'll be throwing the run and wasting everyone's time if you actually stop to try and test a mysterious item description. In reality, it just means that one of three things will happen. Either someone explains it to you so that you can not weigh your team down, or you just read an online wiki or guide that explains it, or someone gets mad at you for not already knowing it. None of these are compelling outcomes, and they don't achieve the mystery or discovery aspects that make them good mechanics in a normal Souls-like. Here, they're very much just friction before you get to the good gameplay experience. Whether this was just a layover from reusing the Elden Ring base, or an intentional design choice is unclear, but either way, it doesn't work. This ends up making the base Elden Ring game feel like a required tutorial to properly understand the mechanics. But then at the same time, there's so much that's secretly different from base Elden Ring despite using the same assets, that having knowledge of Elden Ring is also a major detriment to properly understanding this game. Things like scaling from weapons you already know being totally different, the effects of different consumables and active items being radically changed, smithing stones scaling completely differently, and tons upon tons of other small details. This is all stuff that an experienced Elden Ring player has so ingrained into their brain that they aren't even noticing that it's changed, and so a player with no knowledge would be at an advantage because they don't have to unlearn so many habits and pieces of information. In Elden Ring, you only use boluses to cure an ailment. In Nightreign, you eat them to increase your max resistance and also to heal your health. In Elden Ring, converting a weapon to an elemental type will cut the damage massively until you have the scaling stats bumped up, but here, elemental weapons actually gain power when slapping an element on it, to the point where not using an elemental infusion is like playing with only one arm. In Elden Ring, a smithing stone provides a small boost to power. In Nightreign, smithing stones are the largest single power increase besides just finding a more powerful weapon. Pure stats on a relic seems good, but in reality is fairly worthless. I tested this out across a bunch of characters and found that adding 1 dex or strength typically added 1 or 2 damage to a swing. I tested a lot using Wilder at level 7 because that's a good midway point into the scaling, and it put his damage from a swing at almost exactly 100, which made calculating percents easy. Adding 2 dex went from 98 to 100 damage. Adding 2 strength went from 98 to 100 damage. Adding a combination of both only went to 103 damage. You could be using 3 relic slots to get effectively 5 or 6 extra damage per swing. Contrast that with the options starting with an Everjail key, which will likely give 10 to 20k souls, or a 4 to 10% damage increase, or a 12 to 24% defense increase, and there's no comparison. Plus, it gives that to everyone in the party and uses 1/3 of the total slots. I don't actually have a problem with the power level discrepancy. From a design perspective, it makes sense that the more complicated strategic option has a better payoff than simply pumping stats, and I especially like this because in a lot of games, including the Dark Souls franchise, simply pumping stats is the better option to trying to find a more complicated synergy combo. But the issue is the lack of clarity behind these choices. After 30 hours, my friend proudly stated that he had reached +6 strength on his relics, and only realized that was worth about the same as a single white tier item's passive effect when I broke the sad news to him. And I only knew that because I spent a few hours monotonously running back and forth between the relics and the target dummy, equipping and unequipping different combinations of relics to figure out the actual math. A normal player would never learn that and be using a gimped loadout without ever realizing it. Did you know this doesn't give the bonus when wielding two armaments, but rather only for power stancing armaments, which itself is yet another term the game never explicitly defines? Or that great bows don't count as bows for relics like these? Or that this doesn't have anything to do with HP levels, but actually means that after getting a crit, blood grease is applied to your weapon? I already explained why the mystery and obscurity can be okay in a single-player Souls-like, but doesn't work here, so I won't relitigate that. But what's funny is that base Elden Ring actually has even more clarity than Nightreign, because when you are choosing to level a stat, you can directly see what the increase will be to the damage of your weapons and how big the effect of a single stat will be. If even the game where obscuring information actually benefits the gameplay is more clear about this type of thing, then there's absolutely no excuse for these effects to not be more clear in this game. Here, you can't even see your own character's core stats without going into a codex menu. Even leveling up only shows half of the stat changes, so how is a player supposed to make informed decisions about when and how to prioritize levels versus other environmental rewards? The target dummy admittedly provides a lot of tools to tinker around with, but that's also only for player-focused numbers, nothing with enemies or locations, and the weapons are pre-locked to specific rarities. I can't see what happens if I try to bump my starting weapon up to legendary, for example, and I'm sure not gonna waste a full 45-minute run holding my starter weapon into the crater just to find out if it maybe is strong or is a massive mistake. And remember those hidden weapon classes from earlier? You actually can see them if you open up this menu option that is barely noticeable down here. But like it states, it opens the details page of this big tooltip over here to explain the text on the item, and if you're anything like me, you didn't even notice that the weapon class fades in up here. But even ignoring the confusing nature of how to access the extra details menu, the space that it uses to show the weapon class is completely empty and unused before opening the details. There's no reason it couldn't have been shown by default before in the exact same spot. It's not like the menu is overly cluttered with details or information to begin with. Even if you do look up your character's stats in the codex, the game only provides a vague letter grade to show scaling, but if we look under the hood, it's actually still using the base Elden Ring stats system and numbers. And the letters vary wildly in meaning. The Guardian has an A listed for endurance with a max value of 38, but the listed letter for strength is only B, and yet the stat is actually higher at 39. Or the Duchess having the same B grade for Dex and Mind, yet that grade range goes all the way from 27 up to 41, but somehow her Vigor value is in the middle at 39, but only listed as C. The Revenant has almost the same exact stats in Endurance, Strength, and Dexterity, yet the value is listed at D, C, and C respectively. These kinds of oddities are all across every character, and while the numbers do seem balanced well, the fact that this is so hidden is nonsensical. As a Duchess, seeing B for both my Dex and Faith makes me think I will be just as well off with a Faith weapon as a Dex weapon, when in reality my Faith value is 35% weaker. There's no reason for your core stats to be obscure in the first place, and especially so if the listed information is going to be so misleading that it's borderline lying at times. All this actually causes is for players to struggle more and make bad decisions because the game gave them information that couldn't be trusted. And the only way to actually know that the information is wrong and couldn't be trusted is to look to external guides that tell you the real numbers. Now, one could argue that eventually all of the obscure mechanics will be understood by the internet, and players can just look up what everything does. That's true in that it lessens the impact of these obscurely phrased descriptions, but if the player is just going to look it up, it defeats the point of having it be obscure and should have just been properly explained in the first place. There's a reason games like Slay the Spire or Monster Train will explicitly state the effects of event choices, and it's because throwing a run from something that was vague and unclear is a deeply unsatisfying player experience. The player did nothing wrong, and the only way to learn not to do that was by wasting a run finding out what the choice actually does. Meeting up with Libra only to be offered a bunch of vague trades where it's not clear what the player is getting or what the punishment will be means that the player can't make any tactical decisions. Or at least not until they've done the required sacrificing of runs to learn what the effects are, though the effects of Libra are often also so obscure that even after getting the effect, it's not clear exactly what happened. The obscurity is a core aspect of Souls games, and it's possible they just didn't want to tinker with an aspect that is strongly associated with the IP, but this is, in my eyes, the biggest point where they really needed to diverge, or else the biggest trade-off of using the Elden Ring core to speed up development. Even in the broader scope of Souls-likes, there's friction. In a Souls game, the player is encouraged to lock in and keep throwing themselves at a boss over and over again until they master the boss's moveset. In fact, that's arguably when Souls-likes are at their best, design-wise. In Nightreign, that mentality will cause you to lose. Badly. In the exploration phase, finding a powerful enemy means you should leave as soon as possible to spend your time on something more useful. And if we expand that to the larger scope of the Night Lords, viewing the game with that mentality will make the game feel like a series of 45-minute boss runbacks, worse than any runback in any Souls game. That's what I had to realize, and it all clicked. Learning a boss or its moveset is not particularly important. Prepping yourself as best as possible is the actual gameplay focus on display here. In a Souls-like, learning and mastering bosses is arguably the core of the gameplay loop. Here, it's not even playing second fiddle, it's playing sixth or seventh fiddle. The boss fights are hectic enough that you can regularly get hit, not understand half of what the boss is doing, and still be fine. Because the core of the design loop is the preparation. You spend 40 minutes building your loadout, and 5 minutes on the final fight. The Night Lord is a test not of your pro-gamer action skills, but of how well you prepared during the exploration phase. Now, it's still an action game, and if you're a god gamer, you could learn every boss and beat them with no gear, but that's not what the game is designed around. If they just wanted you to fight intricate bosses, then having a 45-minute runback would be terrible design. Instead, the bosses all have just one or two major mechanics to understand, and perfectly dodging, blocking, striking, etc. is not required. The game seems to want you to change your build and to use different tools for different threats, which is the opposite to how a Souls-like plays. In a Souls-like, the gameplay is focused around figuring out how to use your tools to beat a boss. Here, the game is designed to never really let you have the same tools, and instead the challenge is figuring out how to acquire all the tools you need to beat the boss. Since we're getting into the design details of what this game is actually trying to be, here's where I need to address something controversial. I'm not sure if Nightreign is actually trying to be a roguelike. Nowhere in the marketing or on the store page description or in any dev interviews I read do they ever use that term. And if I look at the game as a whole package, it's got some elements that are used in roguelikes, but a lot of the rogue-type elements are fairly underwhelming. There's only one map, there's a handful of stock locations that get scattered into the map that are identical down to the enemy placement, and runs are typically more or less the same, just altered by where your team starts, and which things spawned near you versus farther away. To me, it feels less like a Souls-style roguelike, and more like a Souls-style battle royale that happens to be PvE. And I'm making this distinction not to get pedantic about labels, but to figure out what the devs were intending with their design choices. Because, as it stands, it's not actually very good at being a roguelike, but neither is Animal Crossing, and that would obviously be a silly complaint to make about a game that is not intending to be a roguelike. So likewise here, I think people, myself included, have incorrectly criticized this game for being a bad roguelike when they never really were trying to make a roguelike in the first place. The mechanics that people would point to as being roguelike are the randomized world, repeated runs, and random loot. But those are all exactly how a battle royale works. You queue for a match, spawn into a mostly set but slightly shifted map, and scavenge through randomized loot to hopefully fight the final threat. And the closing ring is obviously a classic battle royale staple as opposed to a roguelike. It very much feels like the way Fortnite has one standard world with stock areas that get swapped around a bit and not a dungeon crawling experience with rooms and paths like a roguelike would be. Roguelikes typically have far more procedural randomization and less deterministic elements, whereas in a battle royale, you want Tomato Town to be more or less the same every time so players know what they're doing when they drop in and can plan accordingly. In a stereotypical roguelike, you would never select your end boss, it would be randomly assigned. In a roguelike, you are starting each run wondering which interesting things will happen to spice this run up. In Nightreign, you're wondering if anything unique will spice up this run. There are the shifting earth events and some smaller random things like night dogs attacking, the turtle mausoleum, a frenzy cloud, or the various raids, but these events are so few and far between that the runs don't feel randomized. Once you've done 10 or 20 runs, each new run will be more or less the same. For a roguelike, that's terrible. For a battle royale, that's about expected. Most matches will be fairly straightforwardly gearing and fighting the final squads. But yet, I still feel the superior game experience is the one that embraces a roguelike structure rather than the battle royale structure that they actually did a rather stellar job of crafting. It doesn't necessarily need to be reformed into a traditional roguelike with no timer and set rooms and branches to explore, though I would also be very interested in seeing that game get made too. The use of a battle royale premise for a roguelike game actually does work, and it's creatively different to anything I've seen in this space, but it needs a lot of refinement. Bump up the frequency of those random events. I want to be flying into a match wondering which wacky things will shake up this run, and not praying desperately for something interesting to happen. I had originally written up a big section as to why it fails as a roguelike before realizing I was basically critiquing it for not doing something that it never really tried to do, and was just inserting my own preconceptions. But because it's still relevant, I'll quickly run through a couple high-level notes that are still important. The game is fun because FromSoft's core gameplay is fun. The roguelike mechanics do not foster that gameplay nearly as well. For a lot of players, the goal of a roguelike is not winning, but seeing how stupidly powerful you can get by the end. That means that often players would rather restart a run that goes poorly than try to recover it. To combat that, roguelikes typically have some kind of reward system that gives the player a bigger bonus if they finish a decent chunk of a run. Slay the Spire, for example, uses Niao, which will give a very basic starting boon, but give a more fun set of options if you at least beat the first boss in your previous run. This is to incentivize players to play out their full runs, and not simply to restart for max rolls. Nightreign has no such mechanics, and due to the multiplayer nature means that to play a run the fun way for a roguelike player means possibly screwing over other players who just want to finish runs. That effect is even exacerbated by the fact that Nightreign runs tend to snowball, so a bad start means being behind the whole run, and with 45-minute runs that's a massive commitment. Especially so because it's very hard to actually lose on day 1 or 2, so a mistake early on might mean you can't ultimately win, but will have to play another 30 minutes before you can lose anyway. Scrolling back through the last 100 runs that the game saved, I only saw one time where I didn't make it to day 3, and that's just because my friends and I tried to do something way too ambitious and it failed, so we wanted to start over. But back to the power fantasy feeling. Nightreign has an exceptionally well-balanced suite of items and tools and buffs that make everything feel viable, but also means that nothing feels hilariously brokenly fun. Yeah, there's technically some ways you can still break the systems, and some items are more powerful than others, but by and large, the loot is exceptionally sterile. A 7% increase to damage might be a solid upgrade, but it feels so boring. These percent increases are all so minor that it's hard to ever get excited, and the few ones that actually are cool, like Ice Storm on sprint or Lightning on dodges, are so weak that they don't do anything. Here's me on a character with 30% increased lightning damage and an additional lightning power up +2 from relics doing negligible damage from my lightning rolls. And yet the effect is still more fun than the actually viable options because it feels cool even if it does nothing. I can't notice a 7% increase to damage, but I do notice these really cool lightning bolts forming around me when I dodge. And that's an issue. The stuff that feels cool shouldn't be something I'm disappointed to find. This balance structure reeks of battle royales where everything is pretty straightforward numbers and percents, because in a PvP game, it feels terrible to lose just because someone else got lucky with the god item. But in a roguelike or even a non-rogue PvE game, having stuff that's more broken and fun is okay. The NPCs aren't going to get upset that it was unfair to them and post negative reviews on Steam. And the players are going to love remembering that one run they did that crazy thing. Instead, the loot structure across a run is very deterministic and sterile. You'll have the same basic build-up to a legendary weapon every run, and the optimal playpath is very similar without enough randomization or changing goals. In a roguelike, you want the player to be adapting their build on the fly based on what they get offered, sometimes with radically different end states. In Nightreign, there's not really anything you'd find that's powerful enough to make you change your strategy. No one besides the Guardian is even looking at shields, much less considering swapping to them or not. Instead, the player is hoping to find the things that fit their character's strategy, and if you find nothing for your kit, brute forcing the default is often still better than adapting. My build strategy is locked in when I choose my class and the boss, and the only audibles I make are to complement my teammates, nothing about my itemization. The spellcasters get a bit of that by wondering which spell they'll invest in, but Iron Eye is always looking for a bow, Executor always wants a katana, Wilder always wants a greatsword, and the differences between bows or between greatswords is usually negligible. But that's again incorrectly critiquing it for not being replayable when the game was never meant to be replayed infinitely. It's highly possible that this was intended to be a game that you play, complete all the bosses, and finish. Given the finality and conclusion type vibes of the cutscene after beating the 8th Night Lord, combined with the achievements very clearly calling this the ending, and the way that each boss gets permanently checked off after beating them once, I wonder if this wasn't even meant to be replayed at all, and was designed more as a single one-and-done type experience. The world doesn't have high randomization because they want you to learn it, complete your ultimate goal, and move on. And the notion that this game was supposed to be infinitely replayable was just a community expectation that was wrongly placed on the game. The reason that all of these random events feel so rare is because they want you to see each thing once and complete it, and then move on. This is much more speculative than my other points, but the evidence is there if you're inclined to believe it. Once you know what you are doing, the game goes from frustratingly hard to boringly easy, and the monotony and similarity of runs makes it not as exciting to repeat. Even when the shifting Earth events do appear to change the map, they're exactly the same each time, meaning the path is the same. There are no unique or on-the-fly decisions to be made, and no tough calls that make you stressed or excited about making an impactful choice. The shifting Earth events actually end up making the pathing for a run even more repetitious and reduce the amount of tactical decision making during runs. Day 1, you'll farm the other side of the map and then clear the special zone on day 2, which is the exact same process every time. It gets dull and repetitive even after just a couple completions. At least with the normal map, there is a bit of decision making as to which side of the map to focus on first. But beyond that, the fact that, at a design level, the more interesting events are somehow the less interesting ones to actually play through is a massive failure of game design. And the difficulty of Night Lords doesn't help with that monotony. Once we figured out a decent strategy, I was winning every run, even with randoms. At the time of writing, I have something like 12 wins in a row. If the core gameplay is focused around gearing up properly, the final showdown is a bit too binary to make that a compelling reward. If you have a cooked run, it's hard to lose before reaching the Night Lord, but you likely simply don't have the power level required to win, and will be forced into a prolonged, draining endurance test of a fight on day 3. A god gamer could still win, but most players will end up losing, and in a very unsatisfying way that makes the past hour feel like an incredible waste. And simply reaching level 15 is enough to easily cruise through every boss, even with lousy weapons. Here's my first run beating Augur, and despite all three of us feeling kinda weak with the items we had, we hit max level, so we cruised through it mostly on autopilot. My buddy mentioned afterwards that he still had 7 flasks left. And we entered with 7 flasks. Oh, what's that? After I wrote the script and midway through editing they announced harder, enhanced versions of the fights? Well, I could just rush out the video before then in order to be first and get the most views. But it's not my style to half-ass things. Obviously we're doing the fully comprehensive critique. If I sound different, it's because I recorded this next section much later than I recorded everything else. When they announced the addition of the enhanced bosses, I was very excited. As I just described, the base versions are fun at first, but quickly become boring due to how simple they are. That works for the core structure of the game, but leaves something to be desired for those looking to keep playing and challenging themselves. My first time beating the final Night Lord, I barely even interacted with him, and still have little clue what he actually does because I had already mastered the systems to where I could just brute force a victory on everything. Enhanced bosses is exactly the kind of addition that the game desperately needed. Though I admit part of that feeling is also probably because I started playing Revenant exclusively, and she just feels so much stronger than every other class. I don't think I ever even lost a non-Everdark run with her. But maybe she's not actually that much more powerful and I had just already learned and mastered the systems by the time I switched. But back to the bosses. I appreciate that the Everdark bosses are a step up in mechanics, and thus fulfill my hope of having something more challenging to strive for, in that I can't beat them while mentally operating on autopilot, but they also still fall short in that they don't quite feel like something I need to study and learn to overcome. It felt like a waste of time to do an in-depth analysis of the base game bosses because even though there is some depth to them, the game is designed around you not really having to engage with any of that depth, like I described earlier, and the enhanced bosses are only slightly more complex than that. They add a layer or two of intelligent mechanics, which I quite like, but I'm still able to kind of fumble my way through and come out on top. I suspect that having a boss that you actually need to practice to master like the typical Souls bosses would be painful to try to learn with 45-minute runbacks between, but these are intentionally posed as the hard mode challenge level bosses. The base bosses being like that would be no good, but these are explicitly for those who are seeking out an extra challenge, so there's more lenience to allow it. Which is why when the new bosses only had a few extra mechanics, that feels disappointing. This was the perfect opportunity to explore what made the game great and expand upon that. Running to the spirit stream to jump into the hurricane is cool, even if I have issues with the clarity of the hitboxes, but it's still something you can easily understand the first time that you see it. And it's something you can do completely on your own. These bosses should have doubled down on cooperation-focused mechanics like the Moth's Parasite requiring another player, or Libra's Sigils being too numerous for one player to handle. More mechanics centered around the 3-player team, and less around the get-good boss punishes. Something like needing to pull the 3 bugs away from each other before they become vulnerable, or Fulgur's nuke needing to be intercepted by another player with some kind of shield they found in the arena. What good is the game being co-op if it's not going to embrace all the new gameplay opportunities from making that design choice? So while yes, these enhanced bosses have new moves and are more dangerous, they actually stray further away from what makes the rest of the game good and what the game itself excels at. Because, quite frankly, it's not good as a roguelike, but it is good as a cooperative adventure. And as much as I would like it to explore more of that roguelike design space too, if it's going to ignore that, it should at least be investing in the part that it actually does succeed at, right? You know, the cooperation. I hope whenever they add more bosses to the game, they take this to heart, because there's this beautiful space for a game like that nothing else really quite does. They dipped their toes in with the base game and found amazing success, so I can only hope that they don't lose that special touch, or else rediscover it when adding any future content. Now that we're done discussing the bosses themselves, let's finish up on the roguelike point, as that update also brought some other changes that further worsen the roguelike experience. They added a way to spend currency to definitively select a Shifting Earth event. That's pretty fine on its own, but it really confirms to me that being a roguelike was never even in the mind of the devs when making this game. The entire premise of a roguelike is that you don't know what to expect when you enter the dungeon. To be able to decisively select what events you will encounter entirely defeats the design goals of a roguelike. It feels much more like a mission selection structure, which works in a game like Monster Hunter, but not so much in a roguelike. And again, that puts this game in a confused spot where the best parts of the game are the roguelike elements, and yet so many of the design choices seem geared to smother the roguelike parts, rather than to embrace and complement them. While the game may not have been designed to be a roguelike, I think it would greatly benefit from being treated more like one and expanding on those aspects of the design ethos. 1 or 2 extra systems for customization between runs would go a long way. Like being able to spend Merc on alternate starting weapons or weapon arts without having to rely on the relic system, which is far too random to make any kind of thoughtful use of those perks. They said the game wasn't a live service, and yet they introduced the enhanced bosses by time gating them. I expect they will eventually all be available, but for a game that's so desperately lacking variety, taking options away each week is a disastrous idea. It could be just to limit creating extra queues, but there's already ways to queue for multiple Night Lords, though they should probably make it a bit more obvious, and possibly even a big default option up at the top. Ah shit, I said the trigger word, variety. I've seen a lot of commentary that the game lacks variety, and while that's true in a larger general sense, I would still disagree in that there's an incredible variety of enemies, weapons, and locations from Elden Ring already to make use of. The lack of variety comes not from the number of options, but from the way they've implemented that variety. Again, I suspect because they were not aiming to make a roguelike, but something more inclined towards learning and mastering set zones. But a roguelike would not have such static areas. Each building contains a massive crowd of the same one or two enemies and a boss. If they wanted to have variety, they could have gone way further with the mixing. Every single enemy could be randomized, or there could be a much larger range of groupings so that the fire zone can pull randomly from a selection of 5 to 8 fire-themed enemies. Instead, it's the same dogs and maidens in the exact same numbers and positions every time. It's not like they are hurting for more enemies to use. Elden Ring has a plethora already made that they've just chosen not to make use of, or have shoved into very niche situations like crabs only being used for one night boss and on the beaches which have little reason to ever visit. Not to mention everything from Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 which they could tap into if they really wanted as well. There's a ton of enemies that are in the game but are only ever used in minor random spots, and even more unused enemies. So the issue is not variety, but the way they've implemented it, putting a hard cap on variety. They wanted the zones to be identical so players could learn them and then autopilot through them. A roguelike would strive to keep you on your toes at every corner, while a mission or match-based game just wants you to focus on the final threat. And Nightreign can't make up its mind as to which side it wants to lean into. Are we playing Monster Hunter, or are we playing Hades? Either option is good if you commit to designing that type of game, but fence-sitting just leaves it as this muddled jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none type experience that doesn't really know what it wants to be. And now we've reached the most difficult section for me to write, communication. Because this game has a lot of issues with communication, and for a game built around 3-player co-op, that's a very important element. But also, a lot of these communication tools aren't strictly required if everyone is just already on the same page, and inevitably, the longer the game is out, they will develop a community meta as to how to play properly, and so players will be default shoved into this box. At which point, the lack of communication tools isn't really a problem since everyone is on vaguely the same page. Which is also an indictment of how uneventful and repetitive the core pathing is, that there aren't even curveballs that would require significant deliberation on how to stray from the meta plan. Sure, if you know what you are doing, you can play in different ways, but without more viable communication tools, the community will have a default expectation of how to play and will fall apart with any deviation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What are the actual communication tools and what's lacking? So, in-game there's a map and players have a basic ping to place. And then in the world itself, players can ping beneath them, or if they're standing on an item, it will ping the item. And that's all the communication tools. I guess technically there's emotes, but Soul-style emotes are far too slow and clunky to be a viable conveyor of information in a game that moves as fast as Nightreign does. If you're playing in voice chat with 2 friends, you can coordinate everything, talk freely, plan on the fly, trade weapons, call audibles, and do everything you need. The game is at its best and truly a delight. All you really need is the map pings and you're good. With random matchmaking, however, it can be a very mixed bag. Typically, since I know what I'm doing, I can just take the lead and everyone will follow my pings, and there's no major issue. Most of my runs were like this and would still go very well, but sometimes another player might want to make a different call. And maybe they're right and it's something I didn't think of. Or maybe they're wrong and just want to do their own dumb thing. I have no way of knowing. Hitting an out-of-the-way cathedral is a good choice if they are in desperate need of a new spell, but if they just want a reroll for a better enchantment, then it's a huge waste of time to do a big detour. And there's no way for them to communicate that other than just spam pinging. Or maybe I want to ask my team which of 2 options to head for. The best I can do is spam pings between the 2 very different locations that will change the trajectory of the rest of our path, and hope they understand. But maybe they think I mean that our path is one and then the other in that order, which would be a very bad outcome. It's situations like these where I found myself desperately screaming into the void, wishing I had even a slightly more advanced ping system. Maybe something like what League of Legends added 15 years prior. A ping that can be dragged to either say go here, retreat, ? Or go later. As it stands, oftentimes the best course of action when hitting a wall is to leave and go somewhere else, and all the game lets me do is spam ping a different location. But they probably think I mean we'll go here after we're done, when what I mean is stop fighting the goddamn overtuned bell-bearing hunter, we will waste our entire day fighting him, and even if we win, the whole run will be lost. Respectfully. In most cases, simply following along, even with a less good choice, is still better than splitting off on my own, but it's always better to simply be able to actually communicate a plan. Because there are those times where running off to do the path that I know works, but without the support of my team, is a losing play, so it's better to just stick with my team. But if my team is repeatedly bashing their head against a threat that is simply too strong, perhaps because they're used to playing Elden Ring where that's a perfectly fine and even encouraged tactic, then sticking around isn't going to help them either. The run is doomed simply because I can't convey the basic message of let's move on. And this relates back to what I said earlier, where a bad mistake can ruin a run, but not for another 30 minutes when you find out you were too weak to fight the final boss. It's not even necessarily bad players, but simply bad calls that can end a run in the most time-wasting and frustrating way. And it's only because the game lacks the core tools to properly convey that information. A new player, or just generally someone who is still learning, can ruin an entire group's run, and there isn't even a way to teach them. I would gladly spend my time to help educate new players, but instead someone sees the Cyclone building for the first time, pings it, and I, knowing that's a day 2 location and a waste to go to now, can only watch in despair as that player runs into it and dies over and over again until the zone eventually covers up them and their souls and they quit, leaving me and my remaining friend unsure what to do. We'll try our best without them, but we've lost so much time that it's probably a guaranteed loss anyway. I've tried going with them to the area and letting them learn their lesson, and I've tried letting them go it alone. Both ways result in us losing 40 minutes of our life because a player wouldn't listen. Or even possibly with a player who would listen, but I had no way to speak before they got tilted and left. And on top of that, the game gives you a leaver penalty even if both players left and you're the only person remaining. The game is literally forcing you to finish wasting your life on this doomed run, even when all players consent to give up and go next. As a quick addendum, I'm not the biggest fan of voice chat, but FromSoft has had voice chat in every game since Dark Souls 2, including Elden Ring, and while it's largely unused, it's bizarre to have not included it in the one game that actually does require communication. Even if most players never turn it on, at least give the option to the players who do want to use it. These critiques are mostly focused on pathing and decisions about the exploration process, but there's also an issue within combat too. Because the game was well made to make use of cooperative mechanics, and many bosses require, or at least heavily incentivize, communication and teamwork mid-fight. Whether that's at the more nebulous strategy level, or on more specific things like Recluse relying heavily on teammates working with her to properly manage her elements. But even beyond that, as I mentioned earlier, every boss has at least one kind of interesting MMO level mechanic, and not being able to communicate this with others makes it hard to actually do the cooperation that the game is so intentionally designed around having. For example, when the poison moth grabs you, it places a poisonous tick on your head that needs to be hit off by another player. Here's me jumping and flailing in front of my teammate, pinging, getting in their way, and just about doing everything I can think of to get them to understand the mechanic and help me. And of course, they just let me die. And from their perspective, they probably thought I was trolling and throwing the fight, when actually it was them who was messing up, but there's no way to communicate that to even let them know so they can learn for next time. If I can't educate my teammate about the boss mechanics, then I need the tools to be able to handle it. Though all you really need is to let my ping highlight the parasite on my head instead of hitting the ground. As a counterexample, here's 2 runs later where even though I actually do know the mechanic, my teammate still had to jump in front of me to get me to notice he had a parasite. Luckily I understood this and helped him, but if the communication is failing even when the player fully knows the mechanics, that's a massive issue. My teammate still had to spend a lot of time and give up their positioning to run over to me to get me to see that I had to do the mechanic for them. Whereas being able to ping a target would let me know that I need to make my way over to him to help him out. And this is of course all not to mention that not knowing the mechanic of a boss like Augur, with a room-wide sleep nuke that will likely end the fight, means having to restart a new 45-minute grind just to get back and try again. And since I can't re-queue with the same randoms, that means that I'm once again just hoping that they already know the mechanic since there's no way for me to explain it to them ahead of time. That's the one boss I dread trying again with randoms, despite how simple it is when you have a coordinated squad, and it's all because the game lacks good enough communication tools. Just like with the parasite, all I need is some way to ping an enemy so that my teammates can see that there's a priority target to go after, even if they don't know what it actually does. I think the addition of the 4 ult pings I suggested earlier, in addition to some way to ping an enemy, would probably be sufficient to properly convey everything needed across every fight in the game. Though, like I said, when everyone's on the same page, the rudimentary tools in the game already are enough to make it to the end every run, but that's again more of an indictment on how little cooperative design space is actually used, and how much interesting space they can still explore by adding more co-op focused mechanics. If Nightreign is at its best when working cooperatively with a squad, then the better the tools to facilitate that experience, the better the game becomes, and the more interesting the challenges are allowed to become as well. But perhaps that's the intended design split behind the enhanced bosses. The base ones are intentionally basic, with little to no communication required so that you can play casually and succeed, while the enhanced ones are meant to take advantage of and require the proper communication of a squad. Okay, we're almost at the end, but first I want to quickly knock out some final bits of critique and praise that didn't fit nicely into any of my more focused topical sections. I'm not sure if this is the multiplayer being laggy or the mechanic being too slippery, but double jumping up walls feels inconsistent where sometimes my character just teleports to the bottom point even though I visually was clearing it just fine, and even jumping in the same spot feels like it sometimes grants you the bonus climbing height and sometimes you just get rejected. Why am I getting a large chunk of bonus height to vault this, but here I'm forced to just fall down again? While I quite enjoy not having a literal timer on the screen and letting that be a more immersive thing you just have to mentally keep track of, I think the game should specify somewhere exactly how long the days are so that the player actually has a baseline understanding, and not have to record or timer run just to figure out the actual core mechanics. It would be enough to just say they're 14 minutes long in a codex entry somewhere. The camera also has several major problems, from having some kind of barrier that prevents the player from properly looking behind them while running, which seems to stem from a rotation setting in the options, to switching targets while locked on being very unresponsive and frequently making locking onto your downed ally much clunkier than it's supposed to be, to completely lacking the option to toggle off resetting the camera when clicking the stick without a target. This has been a standard setting for the entire genre for over a decade, so it's frankly embarrassing to have removed or forgotten about it here. I have never once clicked in the stick with the intention of wanting my camera to rotate in any direction besides towards the target I am looking at, and that unexpected movement to where my character is facing is always a surprising new hassle when I actually just wanted to lock onto a target that the game said was too far away. There's some weird inconsistencies with UI, like how selecting an item off the floor will go right into an empty slot, but selecting an item from a boss drop will open up an extra menu to select the slot even if there is an empty one. In a game primarily designed around minimizing time wasted, having menus operate inconsistently is the ultimate sin. Again, possibly an issue with bad networking, but drops sometimes just disappear or never spawn from a killed boss. Normally, I'd dedicate a whole section to level design, but the way this game is structured, there's kind of just one level with a dozen or so buildings shuffled around inside it. That said, I do want to praise the way that each building and camp does have some secrets tucked away, like hidden paths, chests, and areas, that often make creative use of the new jumping and climbing mechanics. It makes learning the areas fun, though it also problematically rubs up against the time rush nature that the whole game is designed around. Often, it feels that going for those secret areas isn't worth the time when you could have been halfway to another area and another boss drop by now. The fun part ends up not being discovering them so much as just learning to quickly access them once you already know about them. And likewise, the inclusion of illusory walls within a game about rushing through exploration feels like another awkward holdover from its Elden Ring DNA. These are neat areas to explore once. Every run after that becomes busy work, and again reinforces that idea that the game isn't meant to be replayed that much. I don't want to get into the narrative of this game, as the lore behind Souls games is its own massive rabbit hole and far too much for this critique. But I want to briefly touch on yet another aspect of this game being haunted by the Elden Ring ethos. Quests in Souls games are often obtuse, with characters mentioning lightly where they're going next, and the player having to hunt them down. This game lacks a true world, but still commits to the Souls ethos of not telling you where to go or what to do, which means every remembrance quest starts with you running over to the journal to see what the actual objective even is. For some reason, you can't do them naturally in the world and have to specifically queue in to start a remembrance, but you don't get the objective until you run back to the lore journal to see what you have to do. And then typically you have to run back to the journal after each successive step, or else open the map to see the giant quest objective marker, which is only inconsistently there. This is miserable, and the worst implementation of side quests I've ever seen. Souls is usually praised for not having quest markers and being more natural, and whether you agree with that or not, I understand the argument in a single-player game. Here, they've kept the obtuse nature of quests, but added those immersion-breaking quest markers. They just don't tell you what the quest is, and if you want to find out, you have to repeatedly run to the quest log, which is at a set location instead of in a menu you can open anywhere. This very much feels like Souls for Souls' sake, and not because this was an actually fun way to handle quests. All that said, the objectives actually in the world and not the hub are fine and sometimes even fun. There should be an option to die early when downed, as sometimes I would rather die faster and get back sooner than wait, especially in scenarios like when I'm alone, or when all three of us got downed on the same swing and now just have to awkwardly wait and lose even more time waiting for a revive that we know can't happen. Speaking of which, some bosses are poorly tuned, like the Bell-Bearing Hunter, who seems to just have his numbers twice as high as they were supposed to be, which becomes more of an issue because you often can't know if a boss is scaled for day 1 or 2 until you engage it and the first swing one-shots your entire team, thus leading to the doubly frustrating experience I just described. But also, because the time spent on a boss is a massive part of the game's core loop, and it's not fun to have to waste time poking each field boss to know if it's a waste of time or not right now, when that's something that could just be shown clearly instead of hidden behind more obscurity. It's partly game knowledge, but I'm not sure that it actually should be. It can be frustrating to randomly get screwed by a time-consuming boss in a key spot, even with that knowledge. And that's not even considering the wildly swingy time differential imbalance between bosses, where the boss moveset itself can make some encounters much shorter or longer depending on how much time needs to be devoted to chasing after it, or dodging less easily countered attacks. And while I'm on this, the range at which these high difficulty bosses will stay aggroed and can potentially instantly down players is insane. This boss was spamming lightning attacks that will one-shot us from almost an entirely different point of interest. And this boss downed me long after we decided to cut and run from a boss that was clearly too much for us. Having to flee a tough boss is already a punishment. There's no reason to have these bosses keep trying to hunt you down this aggressively, and while these strong ranged moves are very rare typically, they seem to spam them on repeat when you're fleeing. The shifting earth zones are not created equal. The Rot Forest is always good as the immunity and Bloodborne style healing is universally helpful, plus the density of tier 2 bosses means lots of legendaries to loot. The Crater is simply a guaranteed legendary of your choice, which is less ideal than being thrown tons of different legendary options. And the Frozen Mountain guarantees to waste a slot on frost defense and dragon killing power, which is nearly worthless unless you specifically chose to fight the Frost Dragon Nightlord. Colors on relics are completely arbitrary. The colors could at least align with some kind of meaning, such as blue being for spells, green for dexterity, red for strength, and yellow for faith. But instead, you can get anything on any color, which just makes it feel like a weirdly and arbitrarily gated system to pad out game time. The management and filter systems are equally as obtuse and clunky to try to manage such a massive quantity of random junk. Even without the color restriction, relics feel far too random to be satisfying build tools, as most effects are nearly unnoticeable number tweaks, and the actually good unique effects are much harder to come by. That said, those unique effects actually are quite well designed as they let you shape your playstyle in some quite fun ways, but they can also lock you into a frustrating box. If you're fully built around daggers, but the high rarity weapons you are finding are all not daggers, you could take the good weapon, but now it feels shitty because you have abandoned everything that you spent your relic slots on. If the game wanted to be more like a roguelike, then a system allowing the relics to be fused or traded in some way that allows crafting the actual effects players want to have would go a long way. Instead, it's just a pure RNG fest to get the good rolls all on the same relic and on the right color. It's playing into the design ethos of a 1000-hour loot grindfest type game like Diablo, but without any of the tools that allow mitigating those different types of RNG to be worth it and fun. As it stands right now, the random affixes are 99% garbage, being too niche to make good use of. For each good effect, the other two will be like, no longer have to stretch before working out, and 11% discount on your taxes when filing on a Sunday. Especially so in comparison to the pre-crafted relics for sale, which makes me question why this entire system of random ones even exists at all, except perhaps as a band-aid for not having any loot rewards from finishing runs after the first time. Now, a lot of those past few nitpicks are just harping on how the game isn't that much of a roguelike and was designed more as a battle royale, but these are the things to which the game just naturally lends itself better. The game also doesn't track progress in a clearly defined way. I would love to be able to see a progress sheet for each character that shows me which bosses I have and haven't cleared with them, to know my progress and to encourage completion. But that again brings us back to how maybe the game wasn't intended to be replayed and wasn't meant to be this completionist type game where you do everything on every character, and was just meant to be about reaching the endings. Initially, I felt like the time spent to raise allies was too long, especially at 3 bars, but I realized the game kind of needs that to be egregious so that losing is possible. Without a truly difficult system to revive allies, you could chain revives forever and slowly grind all the bosses down, which is clearly not the ideal way to experience these boss fights. Given how much of the game is about prepping for the Night Lord properly, having it be possible to not spawn any camps with the requisite elemental type feels bad. The game should guarantee at least one camp of the proper type. Almost every boss suffers from the classic Dark Souls experience I call the dragon problem, which is when the bosses spend so much time moving around massive arenas that you spend more time chasing after them than actually fighting them. The Day 1 and Day 2 bosses are mostly clear of this, but nearly every Night Lord ends up suffering from this to varying degrees. Despite the poor clarity on what a lot of things do, strategizing and exploring the larger scope tactics creates a fun discovery process. Learning what areas to prioritize and what is less useful, figuring out the right optimization to make sure you still have a couple points of interest to hit on the way after the circle starts closing to the final fight, realizing that the circle damage is weaker than you think and you can spend a lot more time in it to get slightly out of range objectives. Learning all of these tactical intricacies is fun, in exactly the way that being confused about what an item description actually means is not fun. There's a bit of an odd balance quirk where the game is so focused on moving fast for the whole exploration phase that having a slower, more methodical class like Guardian feels a lot weaker, not due to having less usefulness, but because it takes longer to actually achieve its job, which is de facto more of a burden when 80% of the run is about clearing everything as fast as possible. Given this weakness, you would want them to feel especially powerful in the boss fight stage, but instead it only feels equally as strong as everything else. Despite having the bare essentials, the matchmaking lacks a lot of the more fun or expected parts. Things like staying as a team after a run with good players, some kind of post-game stats or celebration screen with your teammates, the ability to block players, and so on. There's a lot of friction between what this game wants to do and how the game tries to accomplish those things. But the pure fun of playing with friends, combined with a very well-made set of core gameplay mechanics, makes this very rough experience still rather fun. They managed to still achieve the fun part of Souls-style co-op, while switching the design focus from intricate boss fights to an exploration looter game. And even the flawed parts of the game are mostly formed with ideas that aren't bad, but just rather not fully explored. There is incredible potential for a quality roguelike game with not too much extra tweaking. While that might not have been what they were even trying to make, what's actually there is very well suited to it, just with a couple nudges in the right direction. And more than anything, getting the co-op experience to not only work as well as it does, but feel fundamentally designed around proper teamwork and cooperation-based gameplay is nothing short of amazing. I really cannot stress enough how well made every single class is, and how elegantly they intertwine with each other to create dynamic new strategies. So while this game achieves very little of what I enjoy from a good Souls-like, that's absolutely fine. Despite reusing the Elden Ring name and core systems, it's doing a radically different thing. And I want more of it, regardless of what label you ultimately choose to slap on it. Because, at the end of the day, it's night. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel and me, which I appreciate, and more importantly, it helps me put out more videos for all of you. I ended up delaying this video by several weeks because I wanted it to be fully comprehensive, even though I knew that that would hurt the reach of the video, especially for a channel as small as mine. But I'm happy knowing that the video is better because of that, and if you appreciated it, please like and subscribe, and of course let me know your thoughts down below. I love seeing what everyone has to say, even if I don't always have time to respond to every comment. I'm still pretty new to doing this, but I have a handful of other videos you can check out if you want to see more. Anyway, that's just my 5 cents. Thanks for watching.